Frank has many fond memories of Maria, the one he refers to as mother, and the third woman to play the role of caregiver to the four youngest Ween's children.
I remember my mother, there were two main areas. One, her cooking. I can still smell the fresh baked bread and taste that buttermilk, freshly turned buttermilk. When we came home from school, I just ran the last quarter mile to get that. Big chunks of freshly baked bread. And the other thing is her wonderful gardens. She grew flowers. I can't imagine how she managed it, but she grew flowers and vegetables. Unbelievable. She was a talk of the area for that.
By this time, the family had moved and was farming at Poplar Point, near Portage la Prairie, Manitoba. Looking back, Frank recalls a somewhat blissful childhood.
Well, when I was growing up, things were quite quiet. We never feared anything. Walk around, things were quiet. My parents' time, they grew up in quiet times, but they lived through violence before they left Russia. And they knew horror and violence like I never knew.
In fact, history would confirm that Abram and Katrina had made the right decision to flee when they did.
Many of my relatives, they stayed there and died or suffered horribly in the Gulag, were thrown into Siberia.
But life back in Russia hadn't always been pain and suffering.
My mother and father grew up in the same village, and so they had many experiences that were common. And they discussed them over the table, particularly the supper table. They'd talk about these things and they'd argue who was right about something they couldn't quite remember in the past. And they'd tell about the happy times and the bad times. And really, we were spellbound. It was another world to us. We'd sit there after supper, so the dishes weren't done till late. We'd sit there listening to this conversation. And I tell you, it was another world. It was a storybook world. You know, we didn't have electricity when I was growing up. We had lamps, kerosene lamps for the table. Those images to me are absolutely fantastic. And we had the special lamp for the dining room table. Well, I remember the name, Aladdin lamp, because it had something new about it. It had a round wick, and it had a big shade on it, and the light was unbelievable. And so the image of the lamp, something that I'll never forget. From the way they talked, at those conversations at the table, you knew how much they yearned for that homeland. There was a real love of that land. Everything they said about it, everything they spoke about the land and how they grew up in it, told you that they yearned badly. And Dad often said if he had the chance, he'd go back.
Unfortunately, neither Abram nor Maria was able to return to the homeland. So they were content to raise a family as best they could here in their new country.
You know, my dad and mother were good parents. I really know it now, and I must have sensed it then.
But a young Frank knew his boundaries.
My dad's authority was well established before I came along. He was never cruel, but he meant what he said, and he always said what he meant. He could spank when he had to, but one glance of those steel blue eyes over his glasses or his newspaper was enough. He could also roar, and what he said often hurt much more than a spanking, because it was rejection, and a spanking was care. They were hard times, you know, but peaceful and safe.
It was tough to make a living as a farmer on the prairies during the Depression of the 30s. The whole family had to pitch in.
We worked hard for it, but we never starved, and we never suffered from the elements, you know, and we got an education. When I think back on it now, those two people established a home for us, where we felt safe and wanted.
Learning the value of hard work at an early age and living in a safe and happy home made the transition from home to school easier. At the age of 6, Frank started his formal education at the Euclid School, 2 miles from his home near Portage la Prairie.
I always enjoyed school. I couldn't wait for it to start because, boy, it was a relief from the summer work and the heat, July and August. Am I the only one that ever felt that way about the summer holidays? I hated them. I'd sooner go to school.
With only one teacher for 9 grades in the Poplar Point School, students were left to work on their own much of the time. This suited the young Frank Wiens just fine.
Of course, we had one teacher for 9 grades, and she could only teach one at a time, eh? The others had to be organized. But I used to finish my work, if it was, say, arithmetic. I'd finish my work half the time, allotted. Well, then if we did that, we were allowed quietly to get up and go back to that library. That's what I did. I spent many a beautiful period reading those books. Those 37 volumes, they were enough reading for 2-3 years of school. And I read them all, at least once, having finished my assignment, whether it was history or English or grammar or math. Or if I didn't go to the library there, sometimes I would just sit and listen to the lessons that were being taught to the grades above me. To grade 7, 8, 9, because they were fascinating. School to me was a real sanctuary. I loved it inside that building. It was full of so many things to me. It was, in other words, a whole creative world.
It was this fascination with learning, this curiosity and this imagination that Frank would later instill in hundreds of young men at St. John's Cathedral Boys' School. But what of Frank's religious background? A former student and current friend of Frank's posed this question: how on earth did a German Mennonite from Russia end up becoming an Anglican?
My parents were of Mennonite background, but my father, by the time I knew him, he had had enough of religious debates hither and yon. He wasn't an atheist at all. He believed in God, but both of them believed in one thing very much for us. We had to go to Sunday school. Somehow we had to get a Sunday school education.
But not just any Sunday school would do for the children of Abram and Maria.
We lived near a place where you saw a black-robed priest walking around, and my father thought that was the Roman Catholic Church. Until one day, a woman appeared in our yard on a summer day, beautiful flowered hat on her head, introduced herself to my mother as Hazel Cartledge, the wife of the priest on that church across the field, and started to speak in Low German to my mother. Well, my mother perked up and they started to chat. And my mother discovered she was a Pennsylvania Dutch. Well, from that day on, of course, they were accepted and we were sent over there. They discovered it was an Anglican church.
And that is how a German Mennonite from Russia became an Anglican, through the tutelage of an Anglican priest.
I discovered that the priest, Harry Cartledge at St. Anne's, Poplar Point, was quite a person. He had spent 15 years of his early life in the mission field at Moosonee on James Bay. He'd lived with the Indians up there, traveled with them wherever they went, trapping, ate their squirrels, lived with very little sometimes, and spent 15 such years, tremendous years. And he could talk about things that really excited one. Just fantastic. And he'd learned to speak Cree, which was also interesting to us. He loved snowshoeing, snaring rabbits. And you know, he had in his study, he had the biggest library I had seen up to that point. 4 walls lined with books. I remember the Kipling books, Mowgli, the Jungle books, and the G.A. Henty books, like With Clive in India, With Wolfe in Canada. They were big, big tomes, and there were lots of them. And he let me use that and read, and he read some things to us, and it was a fantastic experience for me. The man taught me to swim. He let me cut his lawn, throw wood into his basement, paid me for that. And he used to take us on trips, a bunch of us, like Boy Scouts, to different things. I remember the Ridge north of Poplar Point, where he took us for a day of an outing, which ended with the fireworks in the evening. And it was the first time I'd ever seen such a display of fireworks. It was a new world to me.
Of all the influences in Frank's life, it can be argued that this black-robed priest who spoke Cree, loved the outdoors, loved knowledge, and embraced life, had the greatest influence on a young and impressionable Frank Wiens. And so, too, indirectly, did this generous man also influence the young and impressionable boys who later attended St. John's Cathedral Boys' School.
It was Harry Cartledge who opened the doors to adventure for me. That's the kind of church I could accept.
As Frank grew older, the time came for him to look for steady work outside the home. The work wouldn't be easy, but the lessons and perseverance learned on the farm stood him in good stead.
In my 11th year of high school, I was looking for a job for the summer. It was the tail end of the Depression, or near the tail end. There weren't many jobs around, but I had noticed one, and traveling on my bicycle to school, back and forth, I'd noticed men working on the railroad there. And I knew the man that ran it, Andy Hansen. So one afternoon, by complete coincidence, I met them on the railroad crossing that I crossed with my bicycle. So I stopped, and I asked them if there was any chance to get a job there that summer on the railroad. He took a long time looking at me. He said, "No, it's too hard for you." "How old are you?" I told him. "You're not strong enough. You're slim." Well, all that did was make me want it more. I kept telling him, "I can do it. I'm sure I can do it. Give me a chance to do it." Well, the long and the short of it was, after coaxing and coaxing like that, he finally did let me work that summer. So my first experience of work, away from home, away from the farm, at 68 cents an hour. Beautiful, on the railroad. But it was hard. It was very hard.
It was hard work, but it taught Frank a lesson he would endeavor to teach so many others. A lesson that, once learned, would give self-confidence and a sense of self-worth more valuable than all the gold in the world. Who would not want that for their children? But it does not come easily.
This is a terrible part for young people. You're so self-effacing. You don't think you're worth anything as a kid growing up. You feel an unworthiness. That suddenly opens up. Hey, I'm just as good as the next person about thinking about things, you know? Somebody believes I am. Harry Cartledge believes I could do it. Andy Hansen believed I could do it eventually, but he showed me that I had to take all those things my dad taught us about hang on, perseverance, stick with it. You don't take no for an answer and walk away with your tail between your legs. You try again.